So hello, thank you so much for giving us your time today. Whether you are here live, we will also send you the recording. My name is Wendi Yen. I am the Donor Engagement Coordinator here at the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, which we often call CFTE for short. I'm super excited to host this important discussion with an incredible panel. The framework of this is we'll have some time, we'll have some conversation, and you are always welcome to put some questions in the chat, and we'll leave the last 10 to 15 minutes to get to those questions. So I am going to introduce everyone, and if the panel would like to share a little bit about your work or anything you feel is important for our conversation. So Wendi.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning. My name is Wendi Yen Huestis, and for the last 24 years, I've been working in international development work, doing fundraising, marketing, and communications for organizations such as mental illness, education, literacy, refugees, IDPs, and social enterprises and other organizations. So I was lucky enough to fall into the profession a couple of decades ago. So I feel very fortunate to be here today and want to thank Wendi and David for the invite. And then I'll pass it along to Rebecca.
Thanks, Wendi. Hi, everybody. My name's Rebecca. I'm from the UK and based in the UK currently. Rainy England, unfortunately, living up to a stereotype. I have worked in the international development sector for about a decade and a half, quite a multidisciplinary background, so private sector development, a lot of economics, as well as diversity and inclusion, especially around gender, and a little bit on migration as well, which I'll talk about later. And that's one side. On the other side, I also guide yoga and give massage, and it's trauma-informed yoga. Not through you guys, but through someone else. So I hold these two spaces quite separately. So I'm really excited about this conversation, a unique opportunity to bring them together, I hope. And I will pass to David.
Hi, everybody. I love that. I love that technique, the passing the baton. Hi, everybody. I'm Dave Emerson, the co-director here at the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, and really happy to be a participant in this conversation. Looking forward to learning a lot too. I'll pass it to Elizabeth.
Thanks again, Dave and Wendi, for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today. My name is Elizabeth Ringler-Jayanthan, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and TCTSYF based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I currently serve as the behavioral health advisor within the Center for Afghan Resilience at Bethany Christian Services. I've been working within the field of refugee resettlement since 2011 and have worked with different refugee populations, but am now focusing primarily on mental health services for individuals from Afghanistan who came after the evacuation in 2021.
Thank you all. So we have gathered here, and Rebecca had such a lived experience of trying to bring this conversation together. And so we've named this roundtable The Prevalence of Trauma, a Challenge to Global Philanthropy. And in the global philanthropic ecosystem, it's common for trauma to be left out of the equation. Acute and worthy needs like food, shelter, education, employment are addressed, but the underlying trauma sometimes is left to fester, until ultimately undermining the efficacy of many worthy endeavors. So our conversation is centered around insights from your experience in working, globally. Also, to start the conversation about how we can do both, right? How to care for a person's immediate needs, as well as a person's felt and lived experience of trauma. how do we address this in our global giving and the work that's being done around the world? So I'm opening this up for everyone to share their thoughts about this. Wendi, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking of even some of the formerly or currently incarcerated populations with whom I've worked. We're working with one organization, a social enterprise turned nonprofit, of adult illiterate populations within the incarcerated populations, where they're wanting to learn to read so that they can read with their children and grandchildren. And one of the things that's not currently discussed is poverty alleviation and trauma. And I was talking about with the team yesterday about the fact that, trauma really lives in the body. And if you're not given that emotional space to discuss it, it's like that trauma can pass down from generation to generation if it's not given some area to really dissipate and to discuss in a group with other people, with your family members, etc. And I believe one of the books we discussed was The Body Keeps the Score, and that it was part of your center's yoga healing process, which I thought was fascinating. And it's also just amazing that as nonprofit international development bodies, we don't talk about that much. However, I will say there is a shift in at least the literacy field to talk more about social emotional development, which I think is really big progress for us.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that awareness of how things are shifting. That's really great to hear. And also, right, it's about not only that interpersonal relationship, it's also what we pass on and what is passed on in systems. Elizabeth, if you'd like to share.
Yeah, this topic is very relevant within the field of refugee resettlement and the way that it's implemented within the US. So, within our system, we have special programs for when individuals are first being resettled. The initial program is called Reception and Placement, and that's partnered with a program called Matching Grant. And the focus of those programs is to it's really about like the nuts and bolts of picking people up from the airport whenever they first arrive, finding individuals housing, getting benefits set up. Matching Grant is the employment program that individuals are matched with after they've come through the reception and placement program. And it's really about kind of getting people in, getting them into housing, matching them with jobs, and then kind of getting them out of the program, And so one of the things that I had noticed in the work, that I was doing, initially I was working in an employment specific role within resettlement, and our a lot of our clients would, upon, meeting them to enroll them in employment would start to tell their trauma story. Like I would be, doing an intake with them just to find out like, well, where did you work before? What is your education? And then they would, disclose their trauma story. And, as I've explained, to other people, whenever I've talked about this, someone may disclose their trauma story. And then, I was kind of left with saying like, well, do you want the housekeeping job or the dishwashing job? And so it was, the system wasn't set up in a way, to be able to connect people with services to help them to heal so that they're able to, get into, whatever the next step is for them into employment or, education. And so I think there's been a shift, within the field since I had started doing this work. But I think that this is a very relevant topic. And, it's always there's always a scarcity of funding around mental health services. And so the focus is generally on, these initial services and not weaving in, holistic services for the individuals that we may be serving.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth and Rebecca.
There's just so much to say. So I think I mentioned that my background is more in the kind of economic development field, which feels worlds away from the topic we want to talk about. And it is worlds away because it isn't talked about in my experience. And I don't want to extrapolate too much, but this topic of trauma is invisible in the development world that I've worked in. And it's problematic. And I think I'm preaching to the converted, if that's the right term. But if I think from the economic perspective, we know, any rational person knows that mental health challenges are going to have an effect on the kind of economic development of a country. We know that, especially like fragile and conflict affected states, particularly, I think I did a bit of reading to double check if I was had some evidence to back this up, but it says there's almost double the global average of mental health disorders in a fragile and conflict affected state than any other country in any other context. So we know that that's a huge issue, and we know that in this sense the trauma and the mental health issues that may arise from it will have a huge impact on employment outcomes, on educational outcomes, also on health outcomes and all the costs associated with that. So if I wanted to just talk to my, kind of the economic development colleagues about trauma, that's probably how I would try and frame it, to try and bring the conversation into that world. But I've never had that conversation, and it's never come up. So it was the first time I even had to think about it. What is the cost of trauma? What was the cost? Because the second thing I wanted to talk about was the international development sector in general, which is what I work in, is one that is based on scarcity of funding, of time, of energy. Everybody is looking for funding. Nobody has enough. Everybody is working too much to too tight deadlines. And we can take this back. And this is kind of about power, really. Who has the power? Who is calling the shots? And it is not probably the people on the ground, what I'd say, doing all the good work. It's often the funders and it's the donors who are setting these parameters. And so if you have the power is so far removed from the people that are going to be receiving the benefits, hopefully, of the programs that we run, they want to see tangible results. We have to have KPIs. We have to have our log frames. We have to show that we are utilizing this money for tangible good. And how do you do that with something involved with trauma? How do you support somebody to overcome their trauma, embody the trauma, whatever the solution or the kind of strategy we have, in that very dry, unemotional way, basically, that we have to show our funders and our donors. And also with power, again, being situated very far away from the people that we're working with, it's often those programs are designed by people that have less cultural awareness of how that culture that we're working in may best deal with their trauma. We have our own ways, we come with our own ways, whether it's yoga, whether it's therapy. That might not be appropriate at all, but that's all we know. So that's what we maybe offer. So I just say for me, my example would be in when I work in migration, and actually maybe the flip side, a little bit of what Elizabeth was saying. I worked with irregular migrants who had made the journey from West Africa to Europe and then were returned all the way back home. And the question was, what do you do? And it was often, we must find them a job. If we find them a job and housing, then they won't want to leave their country, as if that was the reason in the first place. Psychosocial support was an element of the program, but it was always a smaller element, and it was basic, I would say. And that was it. That's the trauma-led approach. And then maybe just to wrap up, to say everything I've talked about is external as well. I'm talking about how our programs might approach trauma. Internally, within the organizations I've worked with, the trauma-informed approach is becoming a little bit more talked about in my work in diversity and inclusion when we're talking about oppression. But within the economic sphere, not at all. But even so, when it is talked about, I don't think we know internally what that means and how to translate that theoretical idea of trauma-informed approach to work into our actual work. So yeah, anyway, so maybe I've just talked about a lot of issues, but I think mainly power is too far away, language is it's not there, and we haven't done enough internal reflection to even know how to utilize a trauma-informed approach.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And what a segue to Dave, because some of the themes that you brought up were around power, were around language, were around the missing component of a shared experience, which is very much sort of the underpinnings of the CFTE. So, Dave, I'm going to pass this to you if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, so interesting. And Wendi, did you want to add something there as Rebecca was talking?
There was so many juicy things that Rebecca just brought up. I'm writing it down. You go first, David.
Same. I had the same experience with all three of you. Yeah, and for me, so we're coming from this, in a sense, simplistic perspective where we're interested in sharing trauma-informed care in the spaces where we show up. So when I'm hearing this conversation start to unfold and some of the questions like, what does trauma mean? I feel like sometimes those of us that are really kind of in the field of trauma care, sometimes forget that most of us probably never think about or talk about that, right? Like it's a scary and daunting thing just in general to consider trauma and traumatic experience. And then when you add it into very high stakes environments where there is actually a tremendous amount of trauma, it can feel so overwhelming. So some of the questions that are beginning to form just for me are like, how do we talk about that? How do we make that accessible and not terrifying, right? And that the dynamics of trauma are very, very scary. And however, we can approach trauma and trauma care from a different place, a non-fear place. So I'm just starting to think about like, what does that mean to make it accessible? Rebecca, you talked about that economic language potentially. I think we probably can't deny that we may need to engage in that language. So that may be something. And then what does it mean? What would it mean for us potentially to sort of constrain trauma in a financial way? But it might be the way to get this into the ecosystem. So it's like, how do we honor people's experiences of survivorship? So I'll introduce that word. I think with trauma, it's pathologized right from the beginning. So that sort of laying that other layer on folks that are already living in extreme situations is another burden, which I think probably none of us would want to carry that next burden. So for us, a perspective that we take is that depathologizing of trauma, and could we start thinking about that in terms of these systems? How do we talk about survivorship and the impacts that surviving does sort of bring to bear on our whole organism? And then we kind of approach it from more of a strengths-based perspective. But those are just a few things. And the other word that really stood out, I've heard a couple of times so far, is scarcity. And I think trauma operates under that kind of a setting as well. Like only some people get to be human, some people's lives are valued, and there's only enough value for human life to go around, so much to go around. So setting up that dynamic is kind of underlying all of the systems that we're talking about and we're working in. So how do we kind of challenge that scarcity mindset? I think that also would benefit the ability to start to get trauma care into the systems.
And you just reminded me of another thing, David. It's like when trauma isn't recognized. So I think of one organization with whom I work, which is COVID Survivors for Care, and they work with trauma-informed long COVID survivors, where I know I had long COVID, but for people who had long COVID still may not believe some of the memory loss or the fact that you may have long fatigue. And I don't think of it for myself, but for those who are in the organization with long COVID and the trauma that really informs their lives and it not being recognized. And there are so many other diseases and non-diseases that are like that. So to have an organization like yours that really recognizes every disease, I think is one to be applauded. And then going back to Rebecca's point about now with philanthropy, obviously you need to be measuring the inputs, the outputs, and the outcomes. And then how do you really do that for trauma? So a couple of literacy organizations, World Reader and then also NABU, they're looking to end illiteracy by 2030. And so they're also looking at this like outcomes-based finance because there's such a shift right now in philanthropy. Numbers for philanthropic dollars are going down. And so you're seeing more of social enterprises rising because you can do nonprofit and for-profit social enterprises. So you're also seeing more of a switch toward PRIs, impact investing and whatnot. And when you come to education, you may not see more of a return on your investment. You see more of a return on that social impact. And so I see more of that combination of with trauma, it would hard to see that return on investment when you're thinking of social impact bonds or impact-based financing. But if you pair it with something like refugees or with climate finance, green finance, and whatnot, you would probably be able to see that results-based financing and be able to make a better case for it. And I hate to say that trauma as it stands now can't stand on its own, but when you're trying to do research monitoring and evaluation on it, because it's in such a nebulous space as it stands now, until we can get it to be more concrete and more in everyone's colloquial vocabulary, I feel like it'll take some time to be recognized.
Yeah, that's and Wendi, we have found, right? Because as a nonprofit, and as nonprofit, there is, right. We talk about scarcity, we're talking about funding, we're talking about sustainability and growth, and so very often we are met with what is the focus areas, right? And what are the outputs, and how do you measure trauma? How do you measure safety? How do you quantify all those things? And so it's almost like I think about when the medical field is very specialized now, right? You go to a doctor for this, and you go to a doctor for that, and what happens? And can we talk about like you know what is a person's experience? you know, and what do they need to reclaim their own sense of safety and thriving and care? And so you mentioned, collaborations, and I didn't know, Dave, if you wanted to expand a little bit more on some of our work with community leaders and how we've learned from this peer to peer collaborative approach.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about some of what Rebecca was saying in terms of that the cultural sort of translation of, first of all, what is trauma, and then what is trauma care. So like we were saying, from our perspective, we have three models that are theoretically grounded and have a methodology associated with them, but does that mean that they need to be sort of delivered the same cross-culturally? Is there room for collaboration? And I think those kind of questions, I'll just speak for myself here in a way, coming from this Western perspective, which is more medical, I think that's very interesting and hopefully expansive. Like, we have some things to offer, but what would this be like for you? So some of the experiences we've had with now colleagues in the Middle East has been that kind of process. Like, here's what we have. How does this show up for you? And then it becomes this reciprocal kind of collaborative experience where folks then kind of turn it back. Well, here's how it works for us. Like, it's almost kind of like, here's how it works for us. Here's what we need from you, right? Folks speaking to us, and then then we can kind of keep turning back toward each other in that way. And I don't know how that feels for folks who really have all this experience, in the field, but staying connected, right? Building these relationships that last sort of beyond a period of delivery seems like that may create some opportunity. I think we would say that is trauma care. Like, trauma care can't be transactional, right, from our perspective. So I don't know how that lands for everybody who's really worked in this field, but what would it be like to have sort of care be non-transactional and be relational in that way? Does that fit?
Maybe I can add it's linked, but to what you said about, maybe actually what I said originally about, we've come up with our own ways of dealing with trauma that make sense to us in our contexts, etc. And actually taking this out to the international development sector, all the solutions we've come up with for our context from our university degrees in United States and Europe, coming up with the solutions to all the world's problems. Not that we have actually experienced most of them ourselves. And so this is like this colonial legacy of the sector. It's the huge elephant in the room that it's only the last few years people have started to really talk about. And so we know this, yet we still kind of trundle on doing the same. So when you say about partnerships, I think especially if you're bringing what is relatively a new conversation into the sector, so in this case trauma, it would be amazing if we didn't follow the ways of working that have existed to date. So like you said, we are in a position where we had the resources and the opportunity to come up with these methods. But who's to say, just to be curious and to be self-critical, who's to say that they're the best methods? Who's to say that they are appropriate beyond our borders? Who's to say that if somebody else had the resources from a different context, they would have come up with something better or completely different? And so I'm not just thinking about trauma, I'm also thinking about everything we offer, realizing we're so privileged to come up with these solutions and we think they're the only ones. So being curious, and actually, if in terms of partnerships, that is the way. I think it's partnerships and giving others the space to others to also come up with their own solutions. And like you said, this is what we've come up with. It's worked really well. We've done our own research and we've got our own evidence, and it's had really amazing results in our context. How, if maybe not, it could be relevant for you. And so this localization agenda, we call it in development, is still quite strong about trying to make our solutions more local, but we still come up with the solutions externally, bring them over, and then see if we can kind of adapt them to the local context, less so starting from the local context and going backwards. Anyway, so that's my 2 pence. And maybe another is, we're talking about, and this is what Wendi said, like trauma as a standalone thematic that we could bring to this industry, which is one way that, as Wendi said, probably is unlikely to work at this point in time. But then there's the other way of not seeing it as a standalone thing, but more of a way of working, of a way of trying to incorporate this concept and knowledge of what trauma is into our everyday work. And so when somebody is seeing an issue or a problem that we're trying to solve, they see it with this knowledge of what trauma looks like, how trauma could be addressed, and then they incorporate it into their design of their program. And it might not be this person has experienced trauma, so we are going to provide them with this. It could be more. It could be anything, I guess. Really, it's how they relate to that person or that group of people, how they design those workshops, how they even communicate with different people in this more trauma-informed way. And so we've seen that in the world in the work of like gender and our diversity and inclusion. Like we used to have gender projects, we still do, or women's projects, because women have to be seen as separate and they have their separate issues that we have to deal with. And then that moved away from that into maybe we need to think about power imbalances between different genders and incorporate it into the general design of our programs. And so maybe trauma could piggyback off that and leapfrog a little, and that could be the offering. That could be a the kind of trainings that you have, that could be another way to incorporate this idea of trauma into the sector.
Yeah, it sounds like, I wear glasses, so I'm always sort of like, the lens in which we view the world, the perspective, and allowing for diversity of perspective, which includes, trying to share power in that way. Elizabeth, I'm not sure if there's something you'd like to add with your experience of sort of, I know, if I can speak, part of your story that was so powerful for me is that you went back to school, yeah, because you noticed, that what wasn't being, cared for, yeah.
Yeah. So when I had initially been working in the field of refugee resettlement, as I mentioned, I was doing employment services, specifically, with the clients that we served, and because we didn't have any kind of mental health services that were offered. Myself and other case managers within the program were kind of like known and trusted people, that the clients could reach out to, and so we would find that our clients, would disclose experiencing domestic violence, having substance abuse issues, traumatic events, that they've gone through, that they're still dealing with. And when we would try to link with providers, in our area, the providers were not interested or willing, to provide interpretation, for the clients that we were working with, to understand, what culturally appropriate services might look like, to implement, trauma-informed services for the clients that we were working with. And so there was a real scarcity of providers, that we could partner with. And so for me, that was the catalyst for me to go back to school to get my MSW and then my LCSW, because of the lack of resources that were available. One thing that I was also thinking about as we were having this conversation was on the idea of what trauma care may look like, and I was thinking about that in context of working within refugee resettlement. And it's interesting because immigration is such a fraught issue, and particularly, recently it's become a more fraught issue. And so I think traditionally there's been a hesitation, I think, to acknowledge, that some of the individuals that we're serving, may have a need, to be linked with, any sort of mental health services, because, the concern is, like, well, it could be perceived as like, well, why are we bringing people here who have all of these issues, and, they're not going to be able to work. And, this is just going to be too much of a burden, like on our society, in general. And so I think that, from the resettlement perspective, there may have been a hesitation, to really acknowledge this and build in services, because of a fear that it would impact policy, that we wouldn't be able to continue, serving as many individuals, actually bringing people through the resettlement process if it became an even more politicized issue. And I think linking with what Rebecca had mentioned in terms of like the economic piece, that individuals that have gone through trauma may be kind of just almost viewed as like a burden, like an economic burden, And so, and I think that this is another important point, though, too, is that not everyone who has gone through trauma will necessarily want, to be linked with services. And I think that that's also kind of a stereotype, around refugees, traumatized refugees, and not seeing, the resilience, of what, the individuals have gone through and what strengths they do have. I think like the last thing I was thinking about too was, the challenge in being able to provide relevant, culturally appropriate services, and kind of the rethinking, that the way that the Western model is set up may not be the most appropriate model, or the model that that clients may feel comfortable engaging with. And one thing I'll mention, on that topic is that within our program, we've set up what we call the Afghan Advisory Council, to help give input to us on whether or not, the services that we're providing are culturally appropriate, and to think about how to design, the best services for, the community that we're working with. And Dave and I had a conversation previously where we had talked about this really interesting model, that I had heard about that we're hoping to implement at our site too, where another provider that has this grant has started to do. They've started to work with teen boys in the Afghan boys in the community, and what they've how they've chosen to implement the services by having like a cricket group, for the boys. And so it's kind of like a way to integrate, you know, um, psychoeducation around mental health to provide social support, but to do it in a way that would be interesting, to the individuals that are being served, something that's culturally relevant. And so, I think that is another point, that um, as others have mentioned, you need to bring in voices, from the community to find out what would be the best way of providing, trauma services to that community. And, um, you know, being able to design something that will be, that will resonate, with the individuals that you're working with.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Yeah, and it's interesting, right? You're talking about cricket, and yeah, there's here in New York. I think there's the World Cricket thing happening out in Long Island, or which is interesting. It's come here. But yeah, so CFD, right? We're talking about other options, right, that are more body centered, and I think what we're what I'm hearing is, can there be more options? Whether it's collaborative, whether it's, you know, learning and listening and having peer and advisory council. Is there a different way of doing this? Because we're so often coming from this where our framework is the baseline, so much so that we don't even think that we are stuck in our own framework in a way. And so before we head to some questions, and I see Cornelius, I see your question, which is wonderful. I wanted to, quickly, if each of you would like to mention, Elizabeth was talking about, that contrast or the both ends of somebody's traumatic experience, what has happened to them, and also their survivorship, their resilience. And they've survived 100% of their worst days, and how to bolster that. So I'm just wondering, what is each of you, your hope for philanthropy around the world, your hope for this connection and care, globally, if anybody wants to.
Maybe I'll go. Well, my hope is, I think all the change, this sounds a bit cliche, but all change starts from within. So you're talking about a sector that needs to kind of connect with themselves first, to understand what their involvement in trauma, because trauma is also, I'm thinking of a systemic kind of level of trauma as well, not just the individual, but the systemic levels that, and so for the individuals working in the industry, often the first point of contact, that they are not they are not always the best people or the most self-aware people themselves. So you have a lot of hope for them to do work around trauma when maybe it's the work they need to do is on themselves first. And that's not just trauma, it's so many other topics as well. So I think my hope is for those in the sector to be open to being a lot more curious and what's the word I'm looking for? Self-critical, in this kind of awakening that I think this conversation is part of, and especially in the last few years, a lot more self-awareness is coming to the forefront. So yes, my hope is that that continues. Trauma becomes part of that conversation, and that kind of is the beginning of a shift to making trauma something much more acceptable to be talked about internally within the organisation, and then externally within their programs and projects that they work on. So yeah, something has to happen inside first.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, and it's it can be uncomfortable, right? Which is why it's been hard, right? There's a humility. There's also an accountability, right, for some of us to acknowledge. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you, Rebecca, for going first to give me a little extra time to think about it. Because for me, I think no matter what vertical you are in terms of your nonprofit or social enterprise, everything does come back to mental health to trauma. Like I can't, and I advocate for anybody to challenge me about that, because in terms of education, climate change, migration, wherever, even literacy, it does come back to your mental health. And I think of even, so my husband works in the medical system, and so you have trauma level care 1, 2, and 3, but we don't have the same thing in terms of trauma care when it comes to your mental health. And it's, unless I'm wrong with that, but it's really upsetting to know that differentiation takes place. And when it comes to serious mental illness, like what's considered serious mental illness is depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar 1. You don't hear anxiety in that, but anxiety is part of trauma as well. So for me, it's really like making sure that philanthropy can start to fund trauma interventions, because we have to support these direct services to survivors. And we want to advocate for any of these policies that can fund various sectors such as healthcare, education, and criminal justice, because we need to make sure that we're supporting these individuals, these groups of individuals, to heal from any sort of mental health challenges and injustices that they've been going through, to build resistance and create healthy environments that promote well-being and prevent any kind of future harm that they may go through.
Thank you so much, Wendi. Yeah, powerful.
Now I'll just add that I think my hope would be that providing trauma specific services, holistic services are can be viewed as just as important as some of the other services that may be funded. That it's not just kind of like an add-on to a program, but it's a core part of whatever programming may happen. As we had discussed previously, while we want the individuals that we're working with who have survived trauma to be the goal is for those individuals to be thriving, and in order to put all of those pieces together, an essential part of that is being able to, to have that support, to work through some of the trauma that they may have experienced, so that all of the pieces are able to come together.
Yeah, what comes up for me also, Elizabeth, when you say that is part of the story that we can't say, right? I mean, that's the part of the story that the person gets to announce. That they feel like they're thriving, or they feel in their body a sense of safety and support. So often we come in and say this is a safe space. This is this is this is that, but it's something that the person themselves gets to reclaim and feel. Like Dave said, it's not transactional. Dave, is there something you'd like to add?
Yeah, that's echoing everything. But in terms of hope, I'm thinking about the formulation that's kind of coming up for me is coalition building around. The word is anti-trauma coalition building, and I think that could involve all of us, and communities as well. But I think the idea of coalitions that are addressing trauma, able to turn toward it and collaborate on, sort of facing it. It's kind of, it's sort of higher level in a certain sense, but I think that's a hope that I would have. How do we come together around this? I think, and the reason I guess for me is trauma really thrives in a more of a siloed environment, and I think we're talking about that in different ways. Separating people is what's happening at every level of these experiences, including maybe the philanthropic experience, the sort of westernized version of that. There's it seems to be a lot of siloing that happens, and that actually is a trauma dynamic in and of itself. So the idea of forming coalitions around this is both kind of what Rebecca was saying earlier. It's more of a systemic approach to trauma, and I think more practical too. We're kind of all in it together in a sense.
That's a nice segue, right? I'll do a little. Here's our huge mug that says "We heal together." And before I move to the Q&A, I do want to be transparent. I did mention that I am the donor engagement coordinator, so my hope is, if it's possible, Karen is behind the scenes doing her wonderful things. We'll put a link up if it's feasible to give. This is the impact and the care that we are is our mission. There are other ways, right? We're coming up with language, a coalition. If you know of an organization, if you're a part of an organization, if you would like to collaborate in any way, I will put my email here as well. And so I'm going to move this. Oh, also, if I have Elizabeth, if there's ways to, if you'd like, if there are ways that folks can reach out to you all, I'm putting Elizabeth's links here, a toolkit as well as her business website, Rebecca, Wendi, if you'd like to, oh, I didn't put it everywhere. My apologies. I'm going to put it in the chat. Yeah, there are links for folks to reach out to you, and I'm going to, Cornelia said, put a question in before about what would be needed to lift the shroud of silence around trauma and traumatic experiences when and where this is an issue, not just in terms of quantification, but also to get the help where it's needed. This could be cultural or systemic within family dynamics. How can we take these survivors into the equation and make them seen? Yeah. I'm not sure if anyone has thought, right? It's part of our hope here.
I'm struck by that language around seen. It feels to me from like where I sit, again, from this cultural perspective, is people are often, human beings are often unseen, we lose track of people in the context of larger scale events. And I wonder if that might be part of it. I mean, trauma is systemic and very interpersonal, very in the way it lands in our organisms. And it feels like, when I'm hearing that question, I'm thinking, how do we create space for people and not just numbers and kind of larger movements of stuff, the actual people?
Yeah, I think this is not just for trauma. It's this idea of leading with human experience, and it comes up in lots of different like frameworks. So it's kind of thinking of there's a lot of kind of feminist frameworks within international development that seem to be becoming more popular, and those frameworks are about challenging power, leading with human experience, challenging hierarchies, etc. And that conversation is often seen in this feminist conversation. Sorry, those topics are seen in this feminist, conversation. And again, it's what I think we said from the very beginning, that trauma isn't in those conversations, but they're so related, and they very much could be, but it's just not there right now. So I think there's definitely ways that we could lift the kind of shroud of silence within those frameworks that already exist. It's just connecting those frameworks with the topics that are important, for example, in this case, trauma, and realizing that you don't have to start from scratch. So that's where my brain went with that question.
Been offering, we have a few more minutes if you'd like to. Oh, great. I know it takes a while to write. Yeah, Holly, right? In line with the systemic shift Rebecca mentioned and siloing David highlighted, I'm thinking about how folks in power in the financial world, etc., are often traumatized too, yes, or at least institutionalized. And so it's really a two-way street. The financial world can help support trauma-informed work, and CCPSY framework in particular can help normalize ideas of choice and agency for people in power to find healing for themselves. Yeah, exactly. Right? This is not, right, when we're talking about trauma, we're not othering, right? This is all of us, up and down that hierarchy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what is it like to be vulnerable? And I think we set these systems up where the providers, whether they're philanthropists or healthcare providers, are supposed to not be vulnerable and show up in a way where they're sort of infallible. And we found, especially with complex trauma and PTSD, that really undermines the whole process of care when we cling really hard to our kind of delusion that we're infallible or perfect in some way. So how do we create space for the providers to not have to be infallible, be able to be vulnerable in ways?
Yeah, because then we're just perpetrating harm, right? If we're perfect, and it's this other. If we're not vulnerable, if we're not open for feedback. And then my apologies, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but putting in, the component about payment, right? And the finances being a barrier, figuring out Medicaid, how we're so, our care is linked to the insurance, which is linked to employment, which is, the whole system that here in the West or within. Yeah, what a huge challenge.
Maybe just the lovely topic of money, which
yes,
I never want to talk about, but we have to talk about. I just thought I was going off what Wendi said about talking about non-profit sector, and what we're talking about actually is non-profit. But my experience, I've been working in private sector development, which is actually a relatively new-ish strand of international development. When I studied, it was all about non-profits, and the private sector were the bad guys. That's where the problems came from. And then in more recent years, the recognition is that we can't solve the world's problems through charity, and the private sector also has a huge role to play if they want to do positive, have a positive impact. So I don't know. I started thinking about, if you're an employer, for example, if you work in the private sector, I mean, there is also a case to be said, to be put forward, to say trauma, like support for trauma care, would also make sense in your workplace. I mean, if you want to have, and I hate this wording, but it's taking all the human experience out of what we're talking about. But if you have employees and you want them to be productive and efficient and happy and, you know, make a good business, then their mental health is also a huge priority for you. And I have seen, not in the case of trauma, but often the private sector can actually be a leading force in positive change, and the public sector can sometimes be a little bit far behind, because we have different drivers. So yeah, so maybe not limiting this conversation, even though I know it is the title, to the public sector, but also wondering, what could we do with the private sector? Because they also have the finances, and like some people are saying, mental health care is costly, and not everybody has the money to pay for it, but maybe others do.
Yeah. And Heather brought up, you know, which could be a whole other conversation, as I'm looking at time, about, you know, authentic consent, right? How do we lift up voices of survivors without putting that into this framework that can be re-traumatizing? Yeah, yeah. Thank you all so much. What a great conversation. Thank you to the panel. Thank you everyone that is here. Please feel free to reach out to us. I'm so honored to be able to, you know, be the host of this important conversation that I think deserves sharing and further conversation and finding its way into our dialogue. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Great,
everybody.
really great talking with you.
Thank you all.
Nice meeting you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.